Greetings, everyone. Welcome. I'm Naima Hall, the Director of Student Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Programs within the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at STHM. I'm also the Director for the Center for Student Professional Development at STHM as well. I'm joined today by Dr. Deborah Blair, the Director of Organizational Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at STHM, as well as Ms. Melinda Epler. Now, before I introduce Ms. Epler as our subject matter expert for today's dialogue, I want to take a moment to welcome and onboard you all to the very first iteration of STHM Diversity Speaks. This series was designed with you in mind. We are very excited for this work and this particular series, which is really dedicated to nurturing and creating critical conversations within diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the topics for today and many series to come is going to be geared towards education, awareness, and really creating a sense of belonging and community within STHM. Within today's talk, we will focus on allyship and microresistance and really learning how to become a part of the solution and moving the needle in a positive direction on DEI issues. So as far as housekeeping goes for today, the session is being recorded and we will be using the meeting function as opposed to the webinar tool within Zoom to really create an authentic and safe space for sharing and educational awareness. We do ask that during the talk today that you keep yourself muted until we open the session for questions and answers. And if you have a really burning, pressing question that you feel is relevant to the topic being discussed or the dialogue that we're having, please put that into the chat and Dr. Deborah Blair will filter those questions to Melinda or myself. Now, with that said, please join me in welcoming Melinda Epler. She's the founder and CEO of Change Cataylst with over 25 years of experience developing business innovation and inclusion strategies for startups, Fortune 500 companies, and global NGOs. As CEO of Change Cataylst, Melinda is renowned. She's a renowned diversity, equity, and inclusion professional and practitioner, currently working with an industry to solve diversity and inclusion issues in a very comprehensive and collaborative manner. Now, join me in welcoming Ms. Melinda Epler.
And then worked as a consultant on storytelling around social change issues and ended up as an executive at an engineering firm. And that was kind of my big aha moment where I really found myself in a non-inclusive environment. I was the only woman in a leadership team of 19 and kind of hit the glass ceiling in a way that really made me rethink a lot of things. And so I put some structures into place to create change in that company. And then I left my job as an executive to really help create change in the tech industry. And then since have gone beyond the tech industry as well.
So this passion in creating change, and when you think about the social unrest, the social inequities, all of the things that we are currently experiencing within our country and our communities, however we identify, why do you think that allyship, which is probably something that you found out very early on once you hit that glass ceiling, and I'm sure that glass ceiling at some points was opaque for you, you couldn't see through.
Yeah.
But when you hit that glass ceiling, when did it become apparent to you that allyship was important? And why do you think it's important in these discussions that we have about social injustice and social inequities and even social awareness?
Yeah. Actually, my aha moment, I didn't have the term allyship. That's kind of a newer term, but my aha moment actually came when I was at university, when I was getting my undergraduate degree in cultural anthropology. I grew up in Oakland and then in Seattle in a really diverse neighborhood, went to majority minority schools. So always had a diverse group of friends, but it wasn't until college where I came across a group of Black students talking about their experiences and the experiences of discrimination and racism just in everyday life. And I was kind of taken aback. I'd never heard my friends talk about that. It was kind of new to me. So I sat and listened. I just listened and realized that I had this view of the world that was not right, that was not correct, that I was kind of in denial of some of the basic underlying inequities that exist for some people over others. And so that was kind of my aha moment, was on college campus. And from there, I worked to really listen and learn from other cultures that weren't cultures that were not my own, and did a lot of reading, a lot of studying. And that's how I kind of, in documentary filmmaking, was really about creating social change. So I was a, I used the tools of allyship in documentary filmmaking to really tell people's stories in a way that could affect change and also stay true to their own experiences.
Yeah.
So yeah, good.
That's the interesting thing that you brought up. You learn from lived experiences through creating the dialogue between cultures and identities that were different than your own. When you were introduced to all of these things that maybe were not specific to your lived experience, how did you then find out what strategies were effective in becoming an ally, which strategies were effective in becoming a part of the micro resistance? And for those who are not really familiar of what micro resistance can really entail, could you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah. Okay. There was a lot. There was a lot there. Let's talk. Can we define allyship?
Sure. Yeah.
And just define allyship in case folks don't know. So, I define allyship as recognizing that there's an imbalance in opportunity, that is to live, to love, to lead, to thrive, and using your power to change it. So it's prioritizing somebody's health, safety, and well-being over your own comfort, maybe. So because sometimes this can be really uncomfortable, and we can't let fear get in the way. We have to choose courage over fear here. Allyship goes beyond learning. That's a key piece of it, but it goes beyond learning to taking real action, taking real risks, getting outside your comfort zone, correcting systemic inequity. So I learned by doing. I learned by learning. First it's learning, and sometimes that's the first step is just kind of learn and unlearn, because we have been taught in high school, middle school. We haven't been taught the whole history, right? We haven't been taught everything there is to know, and sometimes we've been taught things that leave critical pieces of our history out. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Who writes our history? Who writes our history books? All of that plays a role in what history gets told, what stories get told. So what that is allyship, and really you learn by doing, you learn by taking action. Sometimes you don't get it quite right. So you make a mistake and you get input from other people that you made that mistake, and you take it in, apologize, and then keep learning, keep growing. Did I answer all the questions in there?
Yeah. And then there's another piece of this about strategy. So, what strategies do you think work in supporting allyship? So, there's the definition, understanding what it is, but then there's a strategy, like you said, that action piece that's
Mm-hmm.
important for being an effective ally.
Yeah, I think there's three pieces of allyship. The first is learning to do no harm, doing no harm, because we all harm people without intending to, and it's our job as allies to ensure that we're doing no harm. And so that's understanding microaggressions, the little things that we can do to harm people, what things we say, things we do that can harm people, and then interrupting those in ourselves. It's understanding bias and interrupting those in ourselves as well. Um, all of these things can be really small, but what they add up in somebody's life over time, and it can affect, like biases can affect college application processes, hiring processes, pay and promotion equity, policing and criminal justice systems. We're seeing that a lot. There's a spotlight on that right now, and all of that can have a significant impact on somebody's life. So the first step is really doing no harm. That's the learning part. That's the growing part. That's the disrupting is internal. The second is advocating. If you see somebody is being harmed or potentially being harmed, do something, say something. If they're being belittled, interrupted, disrespected, do something, say something. That's we need to be there for each other. And then the third is really leading the change. We all have the power to create change. And what change do you want to see? Understand what change you want to see, and don't wait for somebody else to do it. It's really on all of us to create that change. So that's leading the change and really taking ownership of this as active allies.
So one of the things that we try to talk about when we talk about micro resistance is through this public established definition that microresistance is incremental, small scale, individual efforts that empower targeted populations. So you just kind of went over strategies for allyship, which pretty much probably mirror strategies for micro resistance. Can you share some of your examples of when you had to be a part of that micro resistance, even when it was uncomfortable for you, and to be an ally to maybe a marginalized group?
Yeah, I mean, it can be little things, like if somebody is being interrupted, interrupt that interruption, right? Make sure that somebody, that person actually has the floor to be able to talk, to speak their truth. It could be, so sometimes people with underrepresented identities have ideas, and they are kind of put aside, and then somebody else takes up those ideas, and that person is championed. So that's another one where we can echo the ideas of that original person. Hey, that Christine had a great idea. Let's really attribute that to that person, and that can fundamentally shift somebody's career. Just even in that moment, that can change who leads a project, who gets credit for an idea, can lead to, in the future, can lead to promotions, can lead to real fundamental shifts in your career. And then there's bigger things. I want to say that micro-resistance is incredibly important. It's what I would call advocacy. But I want to, Angela Davis said it, in a racist society, it's not enough to be non-racist, we must be anti-racist. And then Ibram X. Kendi built upon that to say that the opposite of racist isn't non-racist, it's anti-racist. One either allows racial inequities to persevere as a racist or confronts racial inequities as an anti-racist. There's no in-between safe space of not racist. So when you're in that, when you think of yourself as that in between safe space of not racist, a lot of people are kind of in that moment, but that's not what we need. We need people to resist the norms. We can't become complicit within what's happening now. So that's working internally through our biases and microaggressions, and then externally through processes and systemic barriers that that people may be experiencing. So the micro-resistance is resisting the norms, resisting what is, because what isn't working for everybody. It's inequitable. And then working to change those. We live in a society that can be very racist, very sexist, ableist, discriminatory for lots of people. And so resisting, comfortable in that, and actively work to change that.
And you know what, Melinda, we, like you said, we live in a society where there's identities that intersect and are more vulnerable, risk for discriminatory practices that are, especially if they're systemic. But when we think about these groups and identities that are at high risk of discrimination and oppression, when talking about allyship, what systems and what structures do you think need to be in place or need to be put into practice to kind of offset some of these inequities that most marginalized groups experience?
Yeah. I think it's more about redesigning the current systems. And that's, like I work a lot I work a lot with companies, and I work with them around hiring structures, because that is the base of the first barrier to entry, right? And those hiring hiring systems, processes are not designed for everybody. They're designed, especially I work a lot in the tech industry. They're designed for kind of the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world, right? And not everybody is a Mark Zuckerberg and has that background. And so redesigning those hiring systems to make sure that we're not looking for Mark Zuckerberg on a resume, that we're looking for a diverse set of experiences on a resume, right? Because that's what makes, innovation thrive. And so at that very basic level, there are things that we say in job descriptions that deter some people because it doesn't sound like it's made for me. So just looking at the language and things like that, it's going deep into each of these systems and deconstructing them and reconstructing them. Universities are going through this too. Universities go through this in their processes in the beginning too, to reduce the barriers in the beginning, barriers to entry at that basic level. And then in the workplace also, despite there being a law that says that you can't pay people inequitably, people are paid inequitably. And so that is really what's required, is to really look deeply into that system, what's happening. It's a combination of, performance reviews and how those performance reviews are created. And those performance reviews then turn into whether somebody gets a raise or not, whether somebody gets promoted or not. And then looking at, if somebody isn't having a good performance review, even going deeper and saying, okay, well, did they get the feedback that they needed before they even got to that performance review? And we're seeing data that shows that women and underrepresented minorities are not getting that input at a regular cadence the way that people from majority populations are. So just a couple of examples of how we have to deconstruct. We have to really look at how things happen in order to shift them, because there's inequities all along the way. And it's just biases, personal biases. And part of it is also that it's just a system that's always been there. We just keep accepting it until, and again, it works the same as it does with racism, and being an anti-racist is that we need to be active in in creating that change. Yeah.
Well, you know what, as much as it is realistic for us to say that we want folks to be anti-racist, we want individuals to be allies, to be a part of the micro-resistance, it is very much so also a realism that that's uncomfortable for many individuals to step up and step in. And when you think about all the inequities that happen, you were talking about within the workplace, inequities that happen within hiring practices, inequities that are systemic within even our justice system. How do you become an ally in a space where there's not a lot of space for allyship? And I ask you that specifically because our students and our alumni, the individuals that are participants on this particular Zoom call, they might not necessarily always have the leadership influence or the position of power to shift the needle or move the needle in regards to going towards more of an allyship perspective. But how do we do that from the lens of a student, from the lens of an alumni, early career professional, even someone who is at the C-suite, who hasn't opened the dialogue to these types of critical conversations?
Yeah, the first answer is that you all have the power to do this. You all have the power to create change. And the biggest barrier to allyship is our fears. And so we really do have to move past those and get uncomfortable, because our discomfort means that somebody else might be safer, right? Might have more of an equal opportunity, and it does get easier over time. So embrace the discomfort. That's the first piece. The second is that we wouldn't be in this public conversation around racial injustice right now without allies also protesting.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of those allies are students. So you all do have the power to really elevate this conversation in a different way. It really does take all of us working together to make change happen at a systemic level. I think it's important. You know, one of the pieces of your question was around how to just give ourselves the opportunity to do this, and it's important to create as much of a environment of safety and trust as you can, so that you can call each other out when you make mistakes, right? And do that in a safe way that that continues to provoke learning and growth in the process, because allyship is a journey, and we're all on this journey in different pieces of the journey. So holding each other accountable, and in a way that really helps people continue to grow, doesn't shut people down, but continues to help people grow. So I would recommend avoiding shaming people publicly, and instead give them private feedback whenever you can, because that has a tendency to help people's behavior change more than publicly shaming. It's really helping them grow and learn.
Exactly. And when you think this through a little bit more, at least from the student perspective, there's been this conversation in the news recently about, I don't know if you heard of this, but in the news recently, there's been a conversation about Greek life on campuses and how the systems were put in place to exclude particular groups or identities. And now there's been a push at the student level when you talk about our students being the next generation of change catalysts and those who can actually move this movement even further. The conversations with students has been, I'm not going to be in support, and I'm not saying this is the ideology that I'm trying to put on someone else, but I don't want to be in support of an organization or a structure that intentionally excludes marginalized groups or is exclusive as opposed to being inclusive. So outside of, you know, the example that I just gave with Greek life, what other ways or do you think might be possible for our students or even our alumni to be more inclusive in helping to build that support level and support structure for identities that don't necessarily have a voice? And I know I keep loading you with a whole bunch of deep questions, and I know that, but I think it's important for our students to understand it from this perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Part of it would be to be aware of your own work. So if you're doing presentations, if you're doing reports, if you're doing research, are you doing that in a way that's inclusive? Are you making sure that the work that you're doing represents a diverse population? That is for sure a piece of it. I would also say that if you are experiencing, if you're seeing that you're not getting diverse experiences in your classrooms, and let the professor know, because they may need that feedback too. I actually would also ask if anybody has thoughts to put them in the chat too, because I suspect some of you do. And I would ask you to kind of think about that. What can you do? What are you seeing? What are you experiencing? What is that little flag in your head that you might have kind of ignored? Exactly. And now is the time to not ignore it, to really think about it and do something about it.
That is a perfect segue for us to open this up to that dialogue. Again, we want this to be an educational opportunity for our students and alumni to really take advantage and leverage the experience of Ms. Epler, as well as those on this call that want to be a part of this dialogue. So let's have a conversation at this point. And remember, these are critical conversations for all of us. This was specifically designed with you in mind. So let's have some conversations. Go ahead, Anthony, you have a question.
Hello, Melinda. My name's Anthony Martini. I was wondering what you liked the most about your role as the CEO of Change Cataylst.
I like the ability to really influence multiple companies. Honestly, I have the ability. I'm working with a lot of executive teams right now on building allyship and advocacy internally in their companies, and that feels really good to have those really deep, important conversations and really affect change at the executive level of leadership. Yeah.
Excellent. I believe Thomas Leonard, you also had a question. Go ahead.
Hi, Melinda. I'm Thomas speaking. So in terms of your role, how do you believe the role data has in showing that diversity in a corporation, and how to utilize that to kind of like spur into this movement, so to speak?
Yeah, data is super important, especially because a lot of executives really respond to data. And so measuring what matters is what they say is, I have a weekly podcast series, and actually any of you can join. Maybe when somebody's asking another question and I'm not talking, I'll put the link in there. And one of my recent conversations was with Danny Allen. He's trying to think of exactly what his title is, but he's a VP and has been working in tech for 30 years, and just recently started working on diversity, equity, and inclusion because he wanted to give back. And one of the many things that he does in his role is he manages a diversity dashboard, which is a data dashboard of really looking at demographics, and not just demographics across the company, but also in individual teams, because then you can kind of see like what's happening on specific teams. And then diversity, equity, inclusion data goes far beyond that to pay and promotion, equity, really dissecting what's happening, what's going on there. And just so you know, an example here is working with a tech company a couple of years ago, and they analyzed their pay equity and realized they had pretty close to gender parity when it came to pay equity. But then they looked deeper. They looked at their promotion equity, and they found that women were being promoted at much lower levels. So you had, sure, when you looked at it across pay equity, it was equitable, but some women had been in their same roles for 5 years longer than the men, right? So that's not equitable. And so really looking at multiple different layers there. And then also, a lot of companies are now doing inclusion surveys, looking, asking their employees how safe they are, how engaged they are, et cetera, and really looking at belonging. And so that's another piece that goes on the dashboard. A third piece, I think third piece is engagement surveys. When you look at engagement across diversity, across different demographics, and also across teams and different demographics, and you can kind of get some insight. And are there some specific teams that we really need to work on? Is there and then as a result of that, what needs to happen there? Is that processes that need to be changed? Is that training that the management needs? What does that look like? Does the team as a whole need to have training? Does the team as a whole need to really, have some safe conversations to really get at what's happening? And then some other things, supplier diversity also goes on that dashboard. So in these big tech companies, they have the power to really fundamentally shift small businesses, right? And it matters who they choose as their vendors. And so a lot of companies are starting to look at their supplier diversity. Are they women owned? Are they minority owned? Are they disabled owned businesses that they're working with, and hold themselves accountable for that? So that accountability is the next piece. Is once you measure it, then what goals are you going to set? Now that you kind of have that sense of what's happening, what goals are you going to set, and how are you going to hold people accountable to achieve them?
Yes, excellent. Yes, and Melinda, that kind of speaks to some of the conversation that we were having about what structures and systems can change and be modified or put in place to help with allyship. And one of our participants here did also put in the chat, when we were talking about uplifting voices to those of marginalized groups. As allies, we need to use our platform and our privilege to help those that aren't getting the same attention. So that is excellent. And we have some other questions here. I know we had Bella. Bella had a question for us, so go ahead, Bella.
Actually, right before you do, I just want to address that a little bit too. And something that you can all do is, if you're being asked to speak, is to look at who else is on, you know, who else is speaking? Are they diverse voices? If they aren't, make sure that they become that panel. If you're going to speak on a panel, ask the event organizer to make sure that there are diverse voices there. Help them get diverse voices onto that stage. That can be a really key piece of that. And then, yeah, amplifying, uplifting, amplifying diverse voices is huge.
Excellent. Thank
Yeah.
you. Bella, your take on this or some questions you have?
Hi, I'm Bella Butler. I just had a question because I plan on like forming a concentration in marketing with my major and stuff, and I was just wondering what your take is on like how companies can make their marketing more inclusive and diverse in the future, because obviously it's really important, especially right now with everything in our current climate and stuff. I was just wondering what your take is on it and what you might have been involved in personally to assist in that process.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the things I used to do for a living is marketing, and so there's a lot. I would say the first step is having a diverse team in the marketing department, right? Making sure you're getting diverse voices, and then also looking at your customer base, because your employees should be reflective of your customer base and who you're trying to reach. If that, that takes time. And so you also need to, in the meantime, if it's not a diverse team, it's really get input from diverse voices. And you can do that a lot of different ways, from focus groups to surveys, to just going out and talking with people, to really get diverse voices in the mix. And when, there's a lot of companies over the last few months that have put out statements around Black Lives Matter. And a lot of those statements have kind of been hollow, which is what people are calling performative allyship, which means that there's nothing behind it, or very little behind it. And so that's another piece that the marketing team can really do is, are we putting out a statement that is real, is true? Because if you're just putting out a statement to put out a statement, that's not going to do. I mean, the NFL actually is a great example. So we have, Colin Kaepernick started kneeling and ended up being completely blacklisted from the NFL, right? Flash forward to 2020, the NFL puts a statement out against Black Lives Matter, says they're going to play the Black National Anthem, but doesn't actually do anything for Colin Kaepernick, doesn't actually create any fundamental change internally. That's a good example of performative allyship. So marketing team should not have allowed that statement to happen. It should have worked internally to make changes happen first. Yeah, I would say also that as a marketing team, you have the power to really elevate voices and amplify voices with the work that you do. So really figure out how you can amplify voices that aren't otherwise heard, because our cultural norms are shaped largely by advertising, by media, by what companies put out into the world and we consume, right? And so you have a real responsibility in marketing and advertising to really create a story that matters and is representative and inclusive.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that question, Bella. Excellent question. Let's also now move on to Becky. Becky, I know that you had a question. You've been patient with us for a while. Go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you for coming to speak with us. So my question is, as you continue to promote DE&I in the workplace, do you see a more positive shift with our current political climate, with the way people are becoming more accepting of these ideas and willing to change their old policies?
Yes, I do. A few months ago, earlier this year, I wouldn't have been able to say racism in my trainings. It just wasn't something that people were willing to look at internally. Maybe sexism, but not racism. So that is a fundamental change. I can go deeper with my trainings now than I could before. We also had a huge wave of inbound requests for consulting and training in June, July, August. I will say though that a lot of it was surface level, that it's just the beginning. It's the awareness stage where people aren't really willing to go deep yet in companies that weren't doing it before, which is unfortunate. But it's the first step, right? Awareness is the first step. And so my hope is that a year from now, some of those companies will be like, oh, oh, you can't just say something. You actually have to go deep and do the deep work. So I think it's going to take some time for some of the, there's a lot of companies that weren't doing anything. And I don't know, I have an alert from Indeed and from LinkedIn on diversity, equity, inclusion jobs, just because I want to see what's going on. And there's so many more diversity, equity, inclusion directors, managers, heads of D&I job openings now than there ever were before. So there's definitely a shift. And then my hope is that shift will start to see some results in a year or two. So that's kind of the positive that, you know, kind of, I think that there will be some change. I will also say that this year has been really difficult to see as a diversity, equity, inclusion practitioner, because people have been disproportionately hit by COVID and shelter in place and layoffs in companies. And so women, Black and Latinx employees are being furloughed at much higher rates, are being laid off at much higher rates. So I think that while it's kind of at the forefront of people's minds in a different way, we might not see such good diversity and inclusion statistics next year, but hopefully that internal work is starting to happen.
Absolutely. And you know, there was a news article on that in regards to the disproportionate effects of COVID-19 and the terminations and the layoffs on women and people of color. So it's excellent that you bring up that part of the conversation and how that even bleeds into our allyship.
Yeah.
We had another question here from Fangming. Fangming, I know you've been waiting for a while. Go ahead and ask your question. Oops, you're muted.
No, I don't see the mute button, but I can't hear you.
Oh, shit.
There we
There
go.
you go.
We can hear you.
Oh, hey, sorry. So as we know, sometimes in society in general, where, you know, the sports industry might be used as a platform to promote a lot of the allyship or, you know, equity, you know, things. So what is your opinion right now on how the society is responding to what the NFL or the NBA or the MLB is trying to promote with all the injustice and, you know, inequity that's been going on the past year or so?
I think people have really mixed feelings about it. Because there's, yeah, like I said earlier, there's not a lot of internal change that's happening in these companies. So you can say all you want externally, but if it's not happening internally, it's not really shifting anything, and it kind of runs hollow. It, you know, rings hollow. You know, when about a week after Colin Kaepernick knelt, Megan Rapinoe did as well in allyship. And she took a risk and jeopardized her career as well. And it really did adversely affect her career as well. She didn't lose her career. And so that is a distinction there, that she, unlike Colin Kaepernick, she didn't lose everything, but she risked everything to do it. And that her doing that has kind of, it rippled across football, soccer, across the world, and has continued to make an impact. And Colin Kaepernick, even though he lost his career and lost a lot, his advocacy has really fundamentally shifted the conversation. There's no question in my mind. And so the individual voices, I think, are a lot more powerful than the brands that are saying it, but not really putting things behind it. So it's really each of us doing it and doing it in a very public way if we can, that can really help create change using our platforms.
You know, I'm gonna skip to one of the questions is in our chat. When you talk about using platforms, if we acknowledge that we have privilege, and privilege is one of the first steps in allyship, that acknowledgement of it anyway, how do you recommend making people feel comfortable or becoming more comfortable with their privilege? And that has been something, remember, I know before we started this call, we were having a conversation about critical race theory and how administration has tried to remove CRT from diversity, equity, inclusion trainings, because this conversation can make many uncomfortable when we talk about privilege and how privilege can be used as a platform for allyship. So how do we become comfortable in having that conversation?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a few different answers to that. When I first heard the word privilege, I didn't like it. I will say that it took me some time to kind of come to terms with it, because I have worked really hard in my career, and I just felt that I had also faced significant challenges. And it's true, all that is true. And I still have more privilege than other people do, simply because of how people perceive me, because I am white. Because I am college educated. All of us on this call have privilege that other people don't have, right? Because I grew up middle class, because I grew up in the United States. That is a big privilege that we have that some people do not have. And so part of this is the internal work of really coming to terms with that. And then, I mean, obviously I did come to terms with that. I use the word privilege in my work and help other people come to terms with it. I think that what can happen is when we do trainings, like unconscious bias training, when it's not done by somebody that is really good at what they do, or is really effective, people can end up feeling like privilege is a shaming. And it's not, yes, you might feel shame, but we're going to do that internally. And it's important not to shame people for their privilege, because it's something we were born with. And it's really what we do with it that matters. We don't sit in that comfort of being privileged and do nothing to help to change the privilege for others, right? We activate that privilege to create change and to use that privilege to create change. And so, yeah, these are hard things this is the discomfort, but discomfort is important. And the second part of your question, how do you recommend making people feel comfortable? Give them the space, give them the space, give them the tools, help them learn, help them grow. Don't shame them. Shaming really doesn't create behavior change. It does the opposite. It can really turn people away. So if somebody if they have the intention of being an ally, of being a good ally, then help them become one.
Absolutely. Great feedback there. Despina, you've been waiting patiently. I know you've had a question there. Go ahead and ask your question, please.
Hi, I'm Despina. I was wondering, what do you think is the most concerning? Like, you work with these organizations and these companies, and are the problems mostly internal, external? Is it the people that are in these positions? Is it the system? Is it a mix? Sort of.
Sorry, I missed the first. Can you ask it again?
Oh yeah, sorry. What did I just ask? Oh, okay. Like, you work with a bunch of organizations and companies, and I was wondering what you think is the most concerning problem right now concerning diversity and inclusion, and if it's mostly internal or external, like where does the problem lie?
It lies in not looking at it systemically and trying to do the easy thing. They want a magic wand to fix it. So often it is unconscious bias training is the one thing that they will invest hundreds of thousands of dollars in doing it across the organization, but they haven't actually fixed the systemic problem. All they've done is told people that they have biases. But if you don't know what to do with that information, if you don't have agency to really shift processes now that you know biases were inherent in those processes, it doesn't do any good, really, except that it kind of, it does a little bit in that it makes people aware that they have biases. So maybe they'll, in one-on-one situations, they might approach those a little bit differently, but it doesn't fix the systemic problems. And so the biggest issue in companies, they want an app, they want one training to fix everything. And it comes later that they realize that they have this aha moment after often they spent a lot of money on the other stuff, to realize that they really need to go deeper. They really need this long-term plan to correct the systemic issues.
Awesome. Almost making it a part of the culture. It's beyond just the one-off annual training, but really helping to create that inclusive culture within the organization. Great question, Despina. We also have one more question in our chat, which is from Taylor, which asks, what is the biggest challenge that you've had to face, I should say, being a woman at the CEO level? And any advice that you can give on how to deal with complacency while pursuing a career?
Is that complacency? Can you explain more, Taylor?
I interpret it as complacency with, this is my gender, this is where the limitations lie, and then those challenges that you face when trying to climb that ladder to CEO and not being complacent.
Okay, well, one challenge is people seeing me as the CEO. So my co-founder is also my husband, not when we first started, but we were together when we first started. He's a Black man, I'm a white woman. There are times when we're both in a meeting together and people only talk to him because he's a man, and times we're more in a meeting together and people only talk to me because I'm white. But generally, people assume that he's the CEO. And so there's a lot of dynamics there about how do we show up as allies for each other in those situations? How do we really advocate for each other in those situations and correct what's the assumptions that are happening, or don't if we don't feel like it's going to go anywhere. So that's a challenge for sure. Is the respect. And the sexism that still exists, and then on top of that, being a CEO of a company focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion is another layer, because at least up until it might shift my thinking as 2020 and 2021 changed, but up until now, diversity, equity, and inclusion work is kind of seen as a charity work.
Right.
It's not seen as a real business, and so people will often assume that we're a nonprofit. And there's nothing wrong with being a nonprofit working on creating change. It's just a different structure. It's a different way of doing business. As a result, getting funding for the work that we do has been more of a challenge. And that's not necessarily because I'm a woman as a CEO, though there may be some of that. But it's also doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work is just devalued in society.
Yeah. It certainly has been devalued. I think there's more awareness around it now, and the importance and the value add to overall organizational practices. But you probably would agree, over time, this has grown through, and exposure has helped DE&I work. But initially, DE&I work was an add-on. It was literally just an add-on, a function, one person that did this maybe part-time within the organization. But now everyone is really starting to embrace this concept of allyship, belonging, creating an inclusive culture in a space in which we all can contribute to a common goal through diverse voices, perspectives, experiences, and cultural experiences and cultures that we embrace. So I think this has been a dynamic conversation, and hopefully bringing some more awareness around allyship, what that is, the steps that you can take, learning from an expert in this field, micro resistance, how to resist the normalcy that we have all become so accustomed to, and moving that needle to be more towards inclusive practices as opposed to exclusive practices. Melinda, I have one more question for you before we wrap up today, and I'll open it up for one last question or a few more last questions from our participants. But whose responsibility is it now to, or at least from your perspective, whose responsibility is it now to be an ally?
Yeah, can you all say in the chat who you think, whose responsibility you think this is based on the conversation we've just had?
It'd be interesting to see respondents.
And I'll wait. I'm just gonna let the yes. Exactly. It's all of our responsibilities. Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. You know, if you're from an overrepresented group and you have more privilege than other people, then it certainly is your responsibility, because you have the ability in a way that nobody else has to really affect change. And also, we all have to work together. We can't wait for somebody else to do this. It really is when we have a critical mass of people really pushing to create change, that's when change happens. So it's not fair that if you're already dealing with barriers to success and opportunity, that you also have to work to create change. And it is what it is. We all have to. And as I said before, that we all are privileged in some ways than other people. Just by simply being in this call, you have some privilege that other people don't have, right? And so we all need to step up and create change together and be allies for each other and out in the world.
Excellent, wonderful. I know, Despina, you have one follow-up. You have a follow-up question from your previous question?
No, from what you just asked about responsibility.
Okay. Yes, go ahead.
So then how do we deal with small-minded people? Do we just, that are adamant about not caring about diversity and inclusion, do we just give up on them? Like, I don't know how to change their mind.
So you decide where you want to put your energy. I will say that, you know, people are on a continuum of allyship. Some people are still in the denial stage or actively opposed. Most people are somewhere along from, you know, observing and learning and taking action as an ally, advocating activism. I have in my career realized that I only have so much energy, and there's so many people that are somewhere in this allyship continuum and just need to know what to do, that I focus my energy on the people that are asking, that want to know what to do. But there's a need to help people along in the other, if they're like not there yet, if they're not aware yet. So if you have the energy to do that, then I would say just recognize where they are, listen to them, because you need to understand them and where they're coming from in order to help give them tools to potentially create change. You can't throw a bunch of stuff at them and expect them to change. You have to kind of listen to them, know what's going on, try to find an access point, try to find, everybody's motivated, everybody has their aha moment in a different way. It could be that they've had some kind of an experience of discrimination in their past that you can kind of like tease out in those conversations. It could be that they have a lot of people have an aha moment when they have kids. So, or they have siblings, or they have parents that are going through something and they kind of recognize it and see it, or they have colleagues that are experiencing something. So you just have to find what that entry point is for them. Is it data? Is it some kind of relationship? Is it is it some kind of experience that they've had that they can relate?
Yeah, and when we think about these relatable experiences as touch points and how we can ignite the conversation with small-minded people, Despina, we have to also recognize and accept the fact that not everybody is on board with this yet. Our country has gotten to this point over hundreds of years, and we are here now. But over hundreds of years, there's levels of frustration, and we feel like the pot is now boiling and it needs to whistle. But with that whistle, we have to make sure that we're allowing opportunity to also understand other viewpoints and perspectives. Because think of a mental model when somebody has been hardwired and conditioned over time, the switch doesn't just flip. It's going to take a lot of additional conditioning, education, and awareness to shift the mindset from being narrow to being more broad. So that was a great question. And I hope that today, we only have 4 minutes left, but the dialogue has been so wonderful and the participation with our participants has been great. I'm so pleased to be able to engage in this conversation with you all. Are there any last questions before we bear Miss Epler adieu and just thank her for all of her time, bid her adieu. And I just want to see anybody else, because I definitely don't want to leave anybody out, because you've taken time to dedicate to the space of learning, social awareness, and just being vulnerable. And we appreciate that. Anyone else? No? All right, just a whole bunch of thank yous coming in. Thank you for your time. So Melinda, any last words that you want to share or leave with us as we just once again say thank you for your time, thank you for this dialogue, and thank you for sharing your expertise.
Yeah, I do see one point in the chat. I don't like to say everyone, since you can only control your own business, but it's crucial for people to be educated more with this type of stuff in order to improve as a whole. Yes, and everyone everyone here can be an ally, and I do wholeheartedly believe, yes, you can't control other people, but you can control yourself.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Yeah. And so what you do matters. How you do it matters. And just part of allyship is also not being too hard on yourself, and making sure that you're taking care of yourself. Like Despina, if you're actively working on the people that are opposed or the denying, that's hard work. And so make sure that you take care of yourself and give yourself moments to heal from those conversations, because otherwise it can kind of consume you. So make sure you're taking care of yourself when you're being allies, and so that you can be there for other people, and continue your journey, continue your growth, continue to learn, continue to listen to people, and get outside of your own networks so that you really do understand different perspectives and new ways, whether that's reading, following people on social media, going to events that you wouldn't normally go to. Really just listen and learn from people that you might not normally do that with. So yeah, thanks to you all.
Yes, thank you. And if you take away anything in addition to all of the nuggets that have been shared with you today, Allyship Microresistance, it is a journey, and embrace that journey and be willing to travel it so that you can see your end result from your contributions and efforts. Dr. Blair, any last questions or any last pieces you want to share?
No, I think this was a fantastic conversation, and I appreciate all the students that came and shared. And I would say that if you enjoyed this first series of Diversity Speaks, to spread the word of what it was like, what the format was like, because we'll do one of these every month, to bring you all together, because this is for you. This is for our students. So we know you have a voice. This is your time to speak. This is the time, as Melinda says. If not now, then when?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Thank you all. Thank you for attending our very first iteration of Diversity Speaks. Look forward to seeing you next time and continuing the conversation. Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Melinda.
Thank you.